Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, hosted by Eric Rostad. Join him on his 15-year journey through the immortal books. He'll share what he's learning, explore profound ideas across time and cultures, and share the one thing he always hopes to remember from each immortal book.
Today I'm going to cover the early Greek philosopher Empedocles. Empedocles was from Acragas, which is on the island of Sicily, which is that little island right below Italy. And you're probably wondering, why was he an early Greek philosopher if he lived in Italy? Well, at that time, Acragas was a Greek colony that was part of this region known as Greater Greece. And if you're wondering what that time was, the time frame that we're talking about for the life of Empedocles was 495 to 435 BC. And those dates are all we don't have his birth certificate, so these are always kind of guesses. But the common time frame given to Empedocles is 495 to 435 BC. He came from a wealthy and a distinguished family, and in fact, his grandfather won the horse race at the 496 BC Olympic Games. So the family had some pedigree going there. Of all the pre-Socratic philosophers, the early Greek philosophers, we have more surviving work from Empedocles than any others. So in fact, if you get a book about the pre-Socratics or the early Greek philosophers, a large portion of that will be fragments and selections from Empedocles. If you have not listened to any of the other episodes I've done about these early Greek philosophers, one of the main things to keep in mind is that all we have is fragments. We don't have their complete works. And so we're working off when Aristotle quotes them, or another philosopher or writer at that time quoted them. And so that's where we're getting the material. So we're obviously hoping that the quotes are true, and that they got the philosopher's quote or their ideas correct. But that's what we're working from is a set of fragments from these different early Greek philosophers. For Empedocles, he was known to have written two works. One was called On Nature and the other Purifications. And the thing about the title On Nature, I think Heraclitus had a work called On Nature as well. That seems to be kind of a common name for a work at that time, On Nature. And so that was one of the works, and the other one was called Purifications, which just sounds like an absolute thriller. There are contradictory accounts of the life of Empedocles, and it's actually kind of funny. There's this writer named Diogenes Laertius, who lived in like 200 to 250 AD, but he put together this set of works that is called the Eminent Lives of the Philosophers. And so he covered all these early Greek philosophers. And so a lot of the accounts that we have of their lives come from this work. And so I went ahead and got that work. And so as I'm going through these early Greek philosophers, I'm reading what Diogenes Laertius had to say about them as well. And what's so funny about Empedocles' account is like Diogenes would write, well, this person said this about Empedocles, and then this person said this, and they're completely contradictory accounts, especially when you're talking about his death. But there are some interesting stories about Empedocles, and one of those is that he raised at least one person to life, and in the story is that he raised a woman to life, and some of the different accounts are that she was either in a trance or that she had stopped breathing and was dead, but either way, he brought her back to life. And so that's one thing that would set him apart from others. And then as in terms of his death, I want to read from the Loeb edition here, which is the Diogenes Laertius work about his death. This also tells about this woman. Hermippus tells us that Empedocles cured Panthea, a woman of Agrigentum, who had been given up by the physicians, and this is why he was offering sacrifice, and that those invited were about 80 in number. Hippobotus, again, asserts that when he got up, he set out on his way to Etna. Then, when he had reached it, he plunged into the fiery craters and disappeared, his intention being to confirm the report that he had become a god. Afterwards, the truth was known. because one of his slippers was thrown up into the flames, it had been his custom to wear slippers of bronze. To this story, Pausanias is made by Heraclides to take exception, end quote. So one of these guys took exception to this story that Empedocles threw himself into the volcano of Mount Etna to prove that he was a god. Apparently it didn't work, but one of his sandals flew up and it was bronze. And so I don't know, maybe you're on the side that he was a god by throwing himself into this volcano, or maybe you're on the other side of that. As for his contemporary, so we're talking again 495 to 435 BC. I like to just talk about who was alive at the same time, just so we have an idea in our head of who else would have been around. I don't know if he met any of these people, but they would have been in Greece or other locations, Asia. So there's Parmenides, Heraclitus, Herodotus, which is kind of cool, Sophocles, and Euripides. Their lives all would have overlapped with the life of Empedocles. This is one of my favorite things, and I'm not quite sure what to do with this, but I think this is so neat. He wrote in epic verse. I don't even know. I can't even imagine what that means for philosophy to be written in epic verse, but that's how Empedocles wrote. And what's really cool is that in Poetics by Aristotle, he mentions that fact and he compares Homer to Empedocles because they both wrote in epic verse. So here's the quote from Aristotle. Homer and Empedocles have nothing in common except for their meter, which is why it is right to call Homer a poet, but Empedocles a natural scientist rather than a poet, end quote. Again, this just kind of blows my mind. I don't even know how to conceive of this, of philosophy being written in epic verse, but Aristotle mentions it, compares Homer to Empedocles. I just think that is one of the coolest things. Here are a few other things about Empedocles before we get into his ideas. And I'm going to read kind of the last part of this account from Diogenes. So here we go. These are some of the main ideas. So his doctrines were as follows: that there are 4 elements, fire, water, earth, and air, besides friendship, by which these are united, and strife, by which they are separated. These are his words. Shining Zeus and life-bringing Hera, Hades and Nestis, who let flow from her tears the source of mortal life, where by Zeus he means fire, by Hera earth, by Hades air, and by Nestis water. In their continuous change, he says, never ceases, as if this ordering of things were eternal. At all events, he goes on, at one time all things uniting in one through love, at another each carried in a different direction through hatred born of strife. The sun he calls a vast collection of fire and larger than the moon. The moon, he says, is of the shape of a quoit, and the heaven itself crystalline. The soul, again, assumes all the various forms of animals and plants. At any rate, he says, before now I was born a boy and a maid, a bush and a bird, and a dumb fish leaping out of the sea. His poems on nature and purification run to 5,000 lines, his discourse on medicine to 600, of the tragedies we have spoken above. And I'll stop reading there. That's just a great introduction to what I'm going to be talking about in the rest of this episode. What I did think was really cool, though, was that he had written tragedies, and it was said that he had written up to 40. I don't think even fragments of those have survived, but that's kind of a neat thing to consider. It's also said of Plato that he wrote tragedies and he, or him or Sophocles and Sophocles, Socrates, but that, it must have been Plato, but that he burned them. Anyway, I think it's neat that he wrote tragedies. I mean, he's writing an epic verse. Why not write some tragedies as well, right? He was, this is the biggest thing about him, and you heard me mention it in those things I just read. He was a pluralist instead of a monist. Now, if you've listened to the other episodes that I've done about some of these early Greek philosophers, like Heraclitus and Thales, I've talked about where they're trying to get to the root of everything. They're trying to get to the basic element of reality, an element singular. These guys identified one element. So Heraclitus, it was fire. Thales, it was water. And by this, they wanted to identify the reality of everything by one principal element. Parmenides, his was being. So you've got Heraclitus, fire, Thales, water, Parmenides, being. What about Empedocles? What does he believe? Well, what you called these people who had just one root of everything, you call them monists. But if you thought there was more than one thing, then you were a pluralist. And so Empedocles is a pluralist. And here is what he thought. He thought that there were 4 roots and 2 motivating factors. And Robin Waterfield, in one of the introductions to these works, to the books, one of the books that I read, he said this was an enormous scientific advance over his predecessors. So in that part I read above, the 4 roots that he identifies, you can think of these as the basic elements of the world, are earth, water, fire, and air. These are imperishable and they are underived. Like they were not created. They have always existed. They're eternal and you cannot destroy them. So there are 4 of those roots or elements, and then there's 2 motivating factors, and the motivating factors are love and strife. These also are eternal. So love and strife are kind of playing with these 4 elements, and they in this way, love is causing the dissimilar things to come together, and strife is causing the similar things to come together. Let me say that again, because it's interesting. Love is causing the dissimilar things to come together. Strife is causing similar things to come together. Love is causing things to join, and strife is causing things to separate. There's this kind of yin-yang element of that, of things working together in that. Let me read one part from kind of what this means. Empedocles, the son of Meton from Acragas, says that there are 4 elements, fire, air, water, and earth, and 2 initiatory forces, love and strife, of which the former is unifactory, the latter divisive. He speaks as follows: For hear first the 4 roots of all things, bright Zeus, life-bearing Hera, Hades, and Nestis, who soaks men's springs with her tears. And then it goes back out from there. Zeus is his name for the seething of heavenly fire, life-bearing Hera for air, Hades for earth, and Nestis, the springs of mortals for seed, or, so to speak, water. And end quote. And again, this is a fragment that's quoted by somebody, and they're talking about what Empedocles believes. But that's how these 4 elements are working together with the 2 motivating factors. What I found to be interesting, and you heard that in some of what I read there, is that he personified them, but he actually deified them. He godified them. He turns these elements and these motivating factors into gods. And so love would be Aphrodite, and then I mentioned what he thought the elements, what gods those related to. So it's kind of neat, he's writing an epic verse, and then he's talking about these elements, but he's relating them to the gods and talking about him in that manner. Robin Waterfield, in that introduction, he had this to say about these things. Each of the 4 roots had equal claim to existence, in that none of them being at all reducible to any of the others. End quote. So everything is a mortal or a temporary compound of the 4 elements, and the way they become a compound is under the influence of love, or the way they get separated is through the influence of strife. Again, so a compound, if these 2 things are put together, like 2 of the 4 things are put together, or 3 of the 4, or 4 of the 4, in differing ways, that's what causes everything else. You've got these 4 elemental roots, and then based on the combination of those through love, that's where we're getting the different things on Earth. And what this meant is that motion and change were possible using these 4 elements, and that eternal things were intermingling. That differs from other of the early Greek philosophers who thought that motion and change, or they spoke about those things in different ways. Let me read a quote here about Empedocles. For all these things, and I think this would be a quote of Empedocles. For all these things, the flash of fire, earth, sky, and sea are one with those portions of themselves which have separate existence in the midst of mortal things. And they, if strongly suited for blending, have likewise been made by Aphrodite to resemble and cleave to one another. But if hostile, they draw far apart from one another, especially in their birth and their blending, in the molding of their forms, in no way accustomed to union and filled with misery, under the influence of strife because it was responsible for their birth. End quote again. So you just see how love unifies strife, makes things separated. Let me read one other part of this, and this comes from the Penguin edition. All right, so here we go. By necessity, he means the change from one to many by strife, and from many to one by love. And by the gods, as I said, he means the four mortal gods, fire, earth, water, air, and the two immortals, who are ungenerated and eternally at war with one another, strife and love. End quote. And that was something that was quoted by Hippolytus in his work called Refutation of All Heresies. I just thought that the reason I wanted to read that one was that he called the fire, water, earth, and air the four mortal gods, and he called strife and love the two immortals. I just thought it was really interesting. All right, next up, a big idea from Empedocles was that of the soul. So he believed in the soul, he believed in immortality, but the way he believed it was that the soul could go between animals and humans and plants. So this ended up impacting his belief on just even things like what you should eat, because you might be eating the soul of somebody if you're eating a plant or an animal. The other aspect of this, and I'm going to read this, why do hounds not smell the tracks when the hare is dead? When it is alive, they perceive it because the smell is continuously given off by the animal. But when it is dead, the smell ceases to flow. For the smell is not left behind in the way in which Empedocles says, it leaves from its feet in the soft grass. End quote. And that was something quoted by Alexander in his work called Problems. So there's some element of a soul giving life and even smell to a being. This idea of the soul tied very closely with a belief in a myth of original sin and fall. And so the way this tied into the soul was that souls were divine, and he believed that there was some sort of a problem that occurred, and it was probably tied to bloodshed, in which people souls were exiled from heaven and were exiled for a specific period of time, which is 30,000 years. And then the way that the souls would get back to heaven was through, I guess, 30,000 years of reincarnation in humans, plants, animals, and you'd constantly be moving your way up. And Empedocles kind of thought of himself as a god. So when he was jumping into Mount Etna, and whether he did that or not, it may just be an apocryphal story, but the idea and the thought behind that story is that it was showing that he thought he was a god. Here's how he tried to prove that he was a god. But at that, he thought he was at like the end of that reincarnation period where you kind of kept moving up to where eventually you're getting closer to being a god as opposed to being a plant or something like that. Let me read apart from the introduction of the Penguin edition, which is put together by Jonathan Barnes. Alongside the science, there is a story about souls. There were once spirits who enjoyed a life of bliss, but they erred. The error is unspecified, but it is usually supposed to have involved bloodshed. And their punishment was a sequence of mortal incarnations. We are all such fallen spirits, clothed temporarily and punitively in human flesh. Animals and some plants are also fallen spirits. Empedocles himself has already been a bush, a bird, and a fish. And I'll stop reading there. So there is one surviving fragment where Empedocles thought that he was had been a boy, a girl, a bird, a fish, and all sorts of other things. He also believed in this golden age. And let me read about this as well. I found this to be really interesting. So I'm gonna read kind of the introduction to this section, and then I'm gonna read a part from Porphyry from his work called On Abstinence, where he's quoting different fragments of Empedocles. So one of Empedocles' poems appears to have contained a description of a utopia or a golden age. And then here's where we go into Porphyry. In earlier times, sacrifices were in many places bloodless. Empedocles is witness to this. When telling of the birth of the gods, he also indicates his views on offerings. Among them was no god Ares, nor tumult, nor King Zeus, nor Kronos, nor Poseidon, but Queen Cyprus. She is love, whom they propitiated with pious statutes and painted animals and subtly perfumed oils, with offerings of unmixed myrrh and a pungent frankincense, pouring libations of yellow honey onto the ground, customs from which even now are still preserved among some people, being as it were traces of the truth. But with the unspeakable slaughter of bulls, their altar was not flooded. End quote. So let me highlight the things that stuck out to me. So he talks about this early time where not even Zeus was alive, nor Kronos, who is Zeus's father, nor Poseidon, but the only one alive was Cyprus, which is another name for Aphrodite. So she's the goddess of love. So she was alive before all of them, according to Empedocles here. And then I love this last thing, the traces of truth. Customs which even now are still preserved among some people, being as it were traces of the truth. So there's this element of connecting to Aphrodite, and when you're considering his philosophy and these two forces that work amongst the roots or elements of love and strife, love is such a big part of that, and he talks about Aphrodite being there from the beginning. I just thought that was really, really interesting, this idea of a utopia or a golden age, but how he thought about that. There are a few other ideas of his that I want to highlight. One was that of monsters. And so with this intermingling of the elements and the roots, sometimes you would get a few Frankenstein-type concoctions. So here we go. These things, and many others were dramatic, are like the monsters of Empedocles, which the Epicureans laugh at, the lumberers with countless hands in the man-faced oxen, end quote. That's a quote from Plutarch in his work Against Calotes. But he's quoting Empedocles, who was talking about these kind of the intermingling of the things, but creating monsters and kind of aberrations of what should have been made. And another idea of his is that the senses are the route to knowledge. And this differed from a lot of the other early Greek philosophers who said you should not trust in your senses. So I like making a note of that just to kind of see who thought what in those early times. Let me read a few different sayings from Empedocles. Kind of like wisdom literature or just like pithy statements. So here we go. Happy is he who has gained the wealth of divine thoughts. Wretched he whose belief about the gods is dark. End quote. That was a quote by Clement. I really want to read Clement. He was one of the early church fathers, but he quotes these early Greek philosophers quite often. Happy is he who has gained the wealth of divine thoughts. Wretched he whose belief about the gods is dark. I thought that was cool. Another one here. Twice and thrice for the noble. A proverb meaning that one should speak often about what is noble. The verse from which the proverb comes is by Empedocles. He says, "For it is noble to say twice what should be said." end quote. And this is a scholarly work on Plato. And but I just love that, twice and thrice for the noble. So speak about the noble often. Just a cool thing that he said. And then another thing, I found this to be really interesting. He also hints at a double world, one intelligible and the other perceptible, one divine and the other mortal, one containing things as paradigms and the other as copies. End quote. This is quoted in a work by Simplicius called Commentary on the Physics. But I found that to be really interesting. The one containing things as paradigms and the others as copies. Last year I started reading Plato, and I got a little bit into his ideas of the forms and how things on earth would be copies of the forms that were in heaven. Maybe that idea came from Empedocles, or Empedocles had kind of sparked the seed that later became that famous thing that we now attribute to Plato. I love kind of seeing these ideas expand over time, and so I enjoy kind of seeing, maybe this is where that idea started. If I'm going to go back to just one thing about Empedocles, the one thing that I'll probably always remember about him, I think it's that he was an epic poet, in that he spoke about these elements in motivating factors almost in a godlike way. And it's almost like that epic poet in him. You can't just talk about earth and air, but you talk about them as if they're gods. You talk about love in the sense of it being Aphrodite, not just this idea of love. You talk about love herself, Aphrodite, the goddess of love. I just thought that was so cool. And especially when he's kind of going a different route than some of the other early Greek philosophers I've talked about so far, where they were looking for that one element, fire, water, air, whatever they thought was that one element. And here Empedocles is saying there's four elements, and they're intermingling or separating based upon love and strife. It's kind of a fun way to think about things, and the fact that he wrote it in epic poetry just has me very intrigued. Well, that's going to do it for this episode. I am going to continue on this path of reading about these early Greek philosophers and sharing with you what I'm learning. My goal in all this is just to better understand Plato and Aristotle once I get to them, because they often quote these early Greek philosophers. And I just wanted to know what they said, what they thought. I wanted to know a little bit about their lives, where they lived, who were they friends with, who were they inspired by, who did they learn from. And so this has been quite an interesting pursuit here, one that I didn't anticipate, kind of a rabbit trail, but it's really helping me. And just even thinking back to the works of Plato and the dialogues of Plato that I did read, it's helping me understand those better. And so I can't wait to go back to them after I've read these early Greek philosophers and kind of make more sense of what Plato is saying. So I'll be back soon with another early Greek philosopher. And until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.